His lawyer leaned forward, placed both hands flat on the mahogany conference table, and said 5 words that made my husband's face go pale. "Your client owns absolutely nothing." The room fell silent. Marcus stared at me across that table like he was seeing a stranger. Maybe he was. Maybe for the first time in 15 years, he was actually looking at me instead of through me. His attorney shuffled papers with suddenly nervous fingers. The mediator cleared her throat. And me? I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, and waited. I had become extraordinarily good at waiting, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, not to the courtroom, not to the divorce papers, but to a rainy Tuesday morning 3 years earlier when I found a receipt that didn't make sense. My name is Claire Whitmore, but I'm 41 years old. For 17 years, I taught advanced mathematics at Riverside Preparatory Academy, one of those private schools where tuition costs more than most people's cars. I have a master's degree in education and a minor in accounting, a detail that will matter later. I've never been the dramatic type. I don't yell. I don't throw things. I solve problems quietly, methodically, the way you work through a complex equation. One variable at a time. I met Marcus when I was 24 and he was 26. He was charming in that specific way ambitious men often are. Focused, driven, full of plans. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and he was good at it. Persuasive. He could make anyone believe anything, really. Including me. We married after 2 years. I was teaching full-time. But Marcus had bigger dreams. He wanted to start his own consulting firm, something that would give him freedom and control. He needed capital. He needed time. He needed support. Just for a few years, he promised. Once the business is established, everything will balance out. So I became the stable income. I paid the mortgage on the house we bought together. Well, that I bought. Though his name went on the deed because we were married and it made things simpler. I covered utilities, groceries, insurance. I worked summer school to bring in extra money. I took on private tutoring in the evenings. Meanwhile, Marcus built his business. And I was proud of him. Genuinely. Watching him succeed felt like watching something we'd created together. His consulting firm specialized in helping pharmaceutical companies optimize their sales training programs. Within 5 years, he had 12 employees and clients in 4 states. Within 10 years, he was traveling internationally, closing 6-figure contracts. I barely saw him anymore, but that felt normal. Sacrifice is what you do for the people you love, right? That's what I told myself when he missed my birthday dinner because of a client emergency. That's what I thought when he stopped asking about my day. That's what I believed when he started criticizing small things. The way I dressed. The friends I chose. The fact that I didn't understand business. Looking back, I can see how methodically he eroded my confidence. But at the time, I just thought I was disappointing him somehow. The cracks started showing about 4 years ago. Marcus became secretive with his phone. He'd take calls in the garage. And he started going to the gym at odd hours. 5 in the morning, 10 at night. He bought new clothes, expensive ones, and seemed irritated when I commented on them. "I have to look successful for clients," he'd snap. "You wouldn't understand." And then came his mother. Diane had always been cool toward me, but after Marcus's business took off, she became openly hostile. She'd make comments about how I was holding him back with my little teaching job. She'd suggest he could do better, that he'd outgrown our starter marriage. She said these things at family dinners, in front of everyone, while Marcus said nothing. His sister Emily joined in. Suddenly, I was the punchline at family gatherings. My career was cute. My contributions were sweet, but not really substantial. They started referring to Marcus's business as his success, as if the years I'd funded his dream didn't exist. I didn't fight back. Confrontation has never been my strength. Instead, I withdrew. I stopped going to family events. I spent more time at school, where I was respected, where my work mattered. And then I found the receipt. It was March 15th, 3 years before the divorce. I was sorting through papers for tax season, another task that had somehow become my responsibility, despite Marcus having an accountant for his business. The receipt had fallen out of a folder marked Business Expenses 2019. It was from a jewelry store in Manhattan. $8,000. The date was our anniversary, a day Marcus had told me he was in Chicago for a client meeting. When I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, just staring at that slip of paper. I didn't wear $8,000 jewelry. I didn't wear any jewelry Marcus had given me recently, because he hadn't. My wedding ring was the last piece he'd bought me, and that had been 15 years ago. I didn't confront him. I don't know why exactly. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear the truth. Instead, I did what I do best. I started gathering information. I wasn't snooping. Not really. I was simply paying attention. Marcus kept his home office locked, but I still did his laundry, still cleaned the house. People get careless when they think they're smarter than everyone around them. They leave credit card statements in jacket pockets. They forget to log out of email accounts on shared computers. They get comfortable. Over the course of 6 weeks, and I pieced together the shape of his betrayal. Her name was Jessica. She was 29, worked in marketing at one of his client companies. The affair had been going on for at least a year, maybe longer. The jewelry receipt was just one item in a pattern of expensive hotels, weekend trips disguised as business travel, and gifts I'd never seen. But I still didn't confront him. You know why? Because one evening, while Marcus was in the shower, I saw his laptop open to an email chain with his attorney. A different attorney, not the one who'd helped us with estate planning. This one specialized in divorce. The email was clinical in its cruelty. Marcus and this lawyer had been strategizing for months. They discussed how to minimize his financial exposure, how to protect his business assets, how to position the narrative that I had contributed nothing substantial to his success. There were calculations about spousal support, timelines for filing, even suggestions about provoking me into looking unstable. One line is burned into my memory. The key is making sure she walks away with as little as possible. The business is yours. We just need to structure things correctly. I closed the laptop carefully. I walked downstairs. I made tea. And I began to plan. Maybe you've been in a situation where someone underestimated you so thoroughly that it almost felt like a gift. That's what this was. Marcus assumed I was too naive, too passive, too boring to fight back. His lawyer assumed I was just a schoolteacher who didn't understand high finance. His family assumed I was lucky to have ever married him in the first place. And they were all wrong. Remember that accounting minor I mentioned? I've always been good with numbers, with patterns, with seeing what doesn't add up. And Marcus's business? It had never quite added up. I started small. I had access to our joint accounts, the ones where my teaching salary was deposited and from which household expenses were paid. Marcus kept his business finances completely separate, but we were married. Legally, I had certain rights to information. I requested tax returns going back 10 years, claiming I needed them for a refinancing application on the house. Marcus barely glanced at my request before signing the authorization. Why wouldn't he? I was just boring, reliable Claire, handling paperwork. Those tax returns were illuminating. Marcus's consulting firm had grown substantially, but the reported income was strangely inconsistent. Some years showed enormous revenue and minimal profit. Other years, the ratios made no sense for a service-based business with relatively low overhead. There were deductions that seemed questionable. There were business expenses that didn't align with the lifestyle I witnessed. I spent evenings after school cross-referencing everything I could find. I pulled incorporation documents from the state registry, public record, perfectly legal. I noted the company structure, the registered agent, the filing dates. I made spreadsheets, I created timelines, and then I found something interesting. Marcus's business was structured as an S corporation, which was normal enough. But 5 years ago, he'd created a second entity, a holding company registered in Delaware. That company owned consulting assets related to the original firm. On paper, this looked like sophisticated tax planning. In reality, it was a shell. He was moving money between entities, showing income in one place while hiding assets in another. It wasn't illegal exactly, but it was aggressive, and it was clearly designed to minimize the apparent value of the business for one specific purpose: divorce. He'd been planning this for 5 years. That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger. Anger is loud and uncontrolled. This was colder, clearer. This was the feeling you get when you finally understand the full scope of a problem and can see exactly how to solve it. I did nothing. That was the hardest part. Continuing to live normally while knowing what I knew. Marcus became bolder in his affair. Jessica started calling the house. He'd smile at his phone during dinner, barely bothering to hide it anymore. He wanted me to notice. He wanted me to react, to give him justification. I didn't. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to say thank you. I know this is heavy, but stick with me. I promise there's a point to all of this. Sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful endings. Marcus filed for divorce on a Friday afternoon. He handed me papers when I came home from work, right there in the entryway, like he was delivering a package. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said. "I've been fair in the proposal. You'll see." I read through the documents that night. Fair. He'd actually used that word. According to his filing, the business was worth approximately $400,000. A shockingly low valuation for a firm that had been operating for 15 years with multiple international clients. The house would be sold and proceeds split. I would receive limited spousal support for 3 years, enough to help with the transition. In total, I'd walk away with maybe $200,000 and no claim to the business I'd funded for a decade. His lawyer's cover letter was almost friendly. "Mrs. Whitmore has maintained stable employment throughout the marriage and is well positioned to support herself independently. The proposed settlement reflects an equitable division of marital assets." Equitable. That was the word they used. I hired an attorney, but not just any attorney. I found Margaret Chen, 63 years old, former forensic accountant, with a reputation for taking apart complex financial structures in high-asset divorces. She was expensive. I paid her retainer with money from my teacher retirement account. Our first meeting lasted 3 hours. I brought everything: the tax returns, the corporate filings, the spreadsheets I'd created, the timeline of entity creation, and the email I'd photographed from Marcus's laptop 3 years earlier, the one where he'd strategized about minimizing my share. Margaret looked at everything in silence. Then she looked at me. "How long have you known?" 3 years. "And you've been documenting this whole time?" "Yes." She smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who'd just been handed a winning case. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband has made several critical mistakes. The first is assuming you're stupid. The second is putting his arrogance in writing. The third is that his shell company structure, while clever, leaves a very specific kind of paper trail. Do you understand what discovery means in a divorce case?" I did. Discovery meant that with proper legal justification, we could compel Marcus to turn over detailed financial records. All of them. "He's going to fight this," Margaret warned. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about 15 years of being dismissed. I thought about funding his dream while being told my career was cute. I thought about his mother's cruelty and his sister's mockery, and his mistress calling my home phone. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Marcus was blindsided by my response to his filing. Instead of accepting his settlement proposal, we filed a counter motion demanding full forensic disclosure of all business assets, including the Delaware Holding Company. His lawyer called Margaret within a day, trying to negotiate. This is unnecessary aggression. Mr. Whitmore has been transparent about his finances. Then he won't mind the audit, Margaret replied pleasantly. The discovery process took 8 months. Marcus had to turn over bank statements, client contracts, revenue records, expense reports, and correspondence related to business operations. Every expense he'd claimed as business-related had to be documented. Every transfer between his companies had to be explained. And here's the thing about lying. You have to be consistent. Marcus wasn't. The forensic accountant Margaret brought in found discrepancies immediately. Seeing that low-value business he'd claimed was worth $400,000, the actual revenue numbers showed consistent annual income over $2 million, with profit margins around 40%. The Delaware Holding Company held intellectual property, training programs, and client databases, worth at least $800,000 conservatively. Moreover, several business expenses Marcus had deducted over the years were personal. The jewelry receipt was just the beginning. There were vacations with Jessica disguised as client meetings. There was a leased sports car titled Under the Business. There were consulting fees paid to his mother and sister for work they'd never actually performed, just money transfers disguised as business expenses. The real value of Marcus's business, properly assessed, somewhere between $2.8 and $3.2 million. And under our state's law, I was entitled to an equitable share of all marital assets. The business had been started during our marriage, initially funded with marital money, my teaching income. I'd paid our living expenses for 10 years while he built it. I had a substantial claim. But Marcus still didn't believe it. Even as evidence piled up, even as his own tax returns contradicted his claims, he remained convinced he'd find a way out. His lawyer started making threats. They'd drag out the case, make it expensive, bury us in motions. Let them, Margaret said calmly. Every delay just generates more documentation of his attempts to hide assets. The judge is already skeptical. During this time, Marcus's behavior became erratic. He stopped paying the mortgage on our house, the house my income had purchased, trying to force a quick sale. I had to use my savings to cover payments. He turned his family fully against me. His mother left me voicemails calling me greedy and vindictive. Jessica apparently moved into his apartment, and according to mutual acquaintances, he had been telling people I was trying to steal his life's work. The irony was almost funny. Through all of it, I maintained my routine. I taught my classes. I graded papers. I showed up. My colleagues at Riverside Prep knew I was going through a divorce, but I didn't burden them with details. I was professional, calm, the same Claire I'd always been. But inside, I was counting down to something Marcus couldn't see coming. The settlement conference was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. This is the meeting I described at the beginning. The mahogany table, the nervous lawyers, and the 5 words that changed everything. We'd been negotiating for 2 weeks leading up to this conference. Marcus had been forced to revise his settlement offer multiple times as evidence mounted. His $400,000 valuation became $1.2 million, then $1.8 million. Each revision came with hostility, with accusations, with his lawyer claiming we were being unreasonable. But Margaret had one more piece of information she'd been holding back, something I'd discovered a year into the divorce process and had kept absolutely quiet until the perfect moment. You see, Marcus's Delaware holding company wasn't just holding intellectual property, it was holding something else: client contracts. Specifically, contracts that were personally guaranteed by Marcus Whitmore. Contracts that included non-compete clauses and penalty provisions if the company failed to deliver services. When Marcus created that shell company 5 years ago, when he was first planning for divorce, he'd transferred most of his valuable client relationships to the holding company. He probably thought this was brilliant. The assets weren't in his main business, so they wouldn't show up in a simple valuation. But here's what he didn't consider. By transferring those contracts to a separate entity that he wholly owned, he'd created a liability problem. If he dissolved that entity, which he'd planned to do immediately after the divorce to avoid splitting its value, he'd be in breach of contract with roughly $4.7 million worth of client agreements. His clients could sue. They could demand their prepaid consulting fees back. They could invoke penalty clauses. In trying to hide his assets from me, Marcus had built a trap for himself. Margaret had spent 3 months quietly consulting with a contracts attorney, documenting every legal liability Marcus would trigger if he tried to dismantle the holding company. We said nothing. We let him keep believing he had an escape route. The morning of the settlement conference, we arrived early. Marcus came in 15 minutes late, confident, his lawyer carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Jessica waited in the hallway, a petty power move that told me Marcus still thought this was a game he could win. His lawyer opened with a revised offer: $1.9 million valuation. I'd receive 35%, roughly $665,000, paid out over 5 years. Generous, he said, considering Mrs. Whitmore's limited involvement in building the actual business. Margaret didn't respond to the offer. Instead, she slid a document across the table, a 30-page analysis prepared by our contracts attorney, outlining every client agreement tied to the Delaware holding company and every liability Marcus would face if he attempted to dissolve or restructure that entity. Before we discuss settlement, Margaret said calmly, I think Mr. Whitmore should understand what he actually owns. I watched Marcus's face as he read. Confusion first, then understanding, then something close to panic. His lawyer tried to maintain composure. This is speculative. These liabilities are contingent. They're contractual, Margaret interrupted. Your client personally guaranteed service delivery. If the entity holding those contracts ceases to exist or fails to perform, your client is personally liable. We've had 3 separate attorneys review this. The exposure is real. The mediator leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, is this accurate? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight. He was recalculating, trying to find an angle. The business structure is complex. It's fraudulent, Margaret said flatly. Your client created a shell company specifically to hide marital assets in anticipation of divorce. He's been transferring income and valuable contracts to that entity for 5 years. Under state law, that's dissipation of marital assets. The judge won't just award my client her equitable share. There may be penalties. Punitive awards. That's when his lawyer leaned forward and said those 5 words. Your client owns absolutely nothing. He wasn't talking to Margaret, he was talking to Marcus. Because here's the final piece. If the business was worth $3.2 million and I was entitled to 50% of marital assets, Marcus owed me $1.6 million. But he didn't have $1.6 million in liquid assets. Most of his wealth was tied up in the business itself. The business he couldn't dissolve without triggering millions in liability. The business he couldn't sell without my agreement as a spouse with a claim to marital assets. He'd boxed himself in completely. Marcus stared at me across the table, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. You knew, he said quietly. You knew about the holding company. I knew about a lot of things, I replied. My voice was steady, calm. I knew 3 years ago, Marcus, when I found your emails planning this divorce, when I saw you calculating how to leave me with nothing. You've been planning this the whole time? No, I said. I've been documenting. There's a difference. You made choices. I just paid attention. The mediator cleared her throat. Perhaps we should discuss a realistic settlement framework. Marcus's lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. We'll need time to review our position. Take all the time you need, Margaret said pleasantly. But understand that if we don't reach an agreement today, we're proceeding to court. And in court, all of this becomes public record. Your clients will learn about your shell company structure. Your business reputation will be questioned, and frankly, the judge is already skeptical of your financial disclosures. This will not go well for you. The room fell silent. I could see Marcus thinking, weighing his options, looking for an exit that didn't exist. His face had gone from pale to flushed. His hands were shaking slightly. What do you want? He finally asked, looking directly at me. 50%, I said simply, of the real value, and full disclosure of all assets before finalization. No hidden accounts, no more shell companies. Everything verified by an independent audit. That's $1.6 million. I don't have that kind of liquid cash. Then you'll need to structure a payment plan, or take a loan against the business, or sell assets. I don't particularly care how you solve that problem, Marcus. You created it. His lawyer whispered something to him. Marcus shook his head. Here they whispered more urgently. Finally, Marcus looked up. If I agree to this, if I agree to full disclosure and the 50%, you don't challenge anything else? No additional claims? No additional claims, Margaret confirmed, provided the audit confirms there are no other hidden assets. If we find more discrepancies, we reserve the right to renegotiate. Marcus looked defeated in a way I'd never seen. This man who'd been so confident, so certain of his superiority, was realizing that he'd outsmarted himself. Fine, he said. I'll agree to the audit and the 50% division. In writing, Margaret said. Today. We'll draft the agreement before we leave this room. And that's what we did. The full settlement took another 6 weeks to finalize. The independent audit found 2 additional bank accounts Marcus had failed to disclose, one in his mother's name, but funded by business transfers, one offshore that had been set up for tax purposes. Margaret added both to the asset division. The final amount I received was $1,847,000, paid in a combination of cash from Marcus selling his share of some real estate investments and a structured note secured against his business. The house sold, we split the proceeds. I received full retirement of my equity contribution. But the money wasn't even the best part. The best part was watching Marcus have to explain to his clients why his business structure was being completely reorganized. Several clients left when they learned about the holding company scheme, uncomfortable with what it revealed about his ethics. His sister Emily, who'd been receiving those fake consulting fees, had to return 3 years' worth of payments, over $80,000, when the audit exposed them. His mother's secret account was frozen during the asset investigation, and while she eventually got it back, the relationship between her and Marcus apparently became strained. Jessica left him 4 months after the settlement. According to mutual friends, she'd expected to marry a successful consultant with money and status. Instead, she got a man who'd lost half his wealth, most of his arrogance, and a significant portion of his business reputation. Funny how that works. I'm finishing this story from my new apartment, a small 2-bedroom place about 40 minutes from Riverside Prep. It's quiet here. There's a balcony where I have coffee in the mornings before school. And I don't have mahogany furniture or expensive art or any of the things Marcus cared about, but everything here is mine. Actually, truly mine. I put most of the settlement money into secure investments. I kept teaching. Not because I needed to financially, but because I like it. Because my students matter. Because being Ms. Whitmore in room 304, explaining calculus to teenagers who think they'll never use it, is genuinely satisfying in a way Marcus's approval never was. Last month, one of my former students, a girl I taught 5 years ago, sent me an email. She's in college now, majoring in engineering, and she wanted to tell me that my class was the reason she believed she could do it. That my patient explanations and refusal to let her give up on herself had changed her life. That email is worth more than Marcus's entire business. And I'm not going to tell you that everything is perfect now. Divorce is painful, even when you win. There are days I feel lonely. There are moments I grieve. Not for Marcus, but for the person I was when I still believed our marriage meant something. But I also feel free in a way I haven't in 15 years. I don't think about revenge anymore. Honestly, I never really did. What happened to Marcus wasn't revenge, it was consequence. He spent 5 years building a trap for me and walked into it himself. I just made sure the door closed behind him. Sometimes people ask me if I regret staying quiet for so long, if I wish I'd confronted him earlier. The truth? No. Those 3 years of patience, of documentation, of playing the role he expected, that's what made the difference. If I'd confronted him when I first found that jewelry receipt, he would have adjusted his strategy. He would have hidden things better. He would have been prepared, but he never prepared for the possibility that boring, passive Claire might be paying attention. That's the thing about being underestimated. People get careless around you. They say things they shouldn't. They leave evidence lying around. They make mistakes because they genuinely don't believe you're capable of noticing. Marcus still doesn't understand what happened. Not really. He thinks I hired a great lawyer and got lucky with a sympathetic judge. He tells people the system is unfair, that I weaponized the courts against him. He can't accept the simpler truth. I paid attention. I was patient. And when the moment came, I was ready. If you're going through something similar, if you feel invisible, dismissed, underestimated, I want you to know something. Your patience is not weakness. Your silence is not acceptance. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is watch, document, and wait for the right moment. Marcus thought he was playing chess while I played checkers, but he never realized I'd been 3 moves ahead for years. The divorce finalized 8 months ago. I haven't spoken to Marcus since. I have no desire to. He's a chapter of my life that's closed. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet click of finality. These days, I'm thinking about what comes next. Maybe travel, maybe writing, maybe just more mornings on my balcony with coffee, watching the sunrise and knowing that everything in my life now is something I chose. I think that's what justice really looks like. Not revenge, not punishment, but freedom. In the freedom to build a life that's genuinely yours, with people who see your value without you having to prove it constantly. Marcus took everything in the divorce. He had no idea what he was really taking: responsibility for his own choices, consequences for his own actions, and a life built on the illusion that he'd earned everything alone. I let him take it. And I walked away with something he never valued and could never understand: myself. That, in the end, was always worth more than anything he could have given me. Thank you for staying with me through this whole story. I hope it reminded you that quiet strength is still strength, that patience is a strategy, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming impossible to destroy